Welcome to Module 2 on Human Subjects Research and how to protect human subjects in the process of conducting research. Before we dive into specific ways that research ethics have been codified, it may be important to touch on the key element of human subjects research, the human subject. So, what is a human subject? A human subject can be defined a lot of ways. The most general classification is that of the living person that is involved in a research study. This may be an interview participant or someone that's involved in a focus group or a patient in a hospital that is getting an experimental treatment. In addition to a living person, a human subject can also be information about a person. So this could be things like their medical records, academic transcripts, or anything that is attached to them and their existence. Metadata about their interactions in the world, social interactions, which any sort of trace element that is used in research can be part of the human subject. As you discovered in the first module, where we discussed the violations of research ethics, even something as simple as blood or cells from a person still constitute the human subject. The case of Henrietta Lacks is a key example of how an individual's information or an individual's biological substance can be a subject in research even when the physical person is not directly attached to that sample. There are a lot of things that count as human subjects research, and then a few things that don't. Human subjects research can include specimen collection, experimental medications, interviewing, psychological testing, changes to the environment of the participant, anything where you are implementing some sort of intervention, any sort of experimental treatment, that will be classified as human subjects research. A few of the things that are excluded are things that are happening, say, in academic settings, classrooms, where it may be a new procedure that is being examined for its effectiveness, but otherwise counts as a fairly normal educational practice. Also, observations that are made in public and the use of secondary research are excluded. While observations of public behavior are excluded, this can get a little tricky because some environments aren't actually protected in that way. So, for example, any sort of institutional setting where a person is required to be there, such as a medical facility, public school, things of that sort, where there is a compulsory element to their presence, those can be a little tricky and may still require going through the normal process or getting approval for it as human subjects research. In the United States, there is a federal guideline called Common Rule, which governs how human subjects research must be treated in a research situation and the types of rights that research subjects have. Common Rule is heavily influenced by the principles of the Belmont Report. And while that report was written in 1978 and approved in the Federal Register in 1979, and then generally adopted by researchers, the Common Rule guideline has been modified a few times, most recently in 2018. Different agencies implement the revisions at different times. For example, UNC Charlotte has deferred implementation of the new Common Rule guidelines until July 31st, 2019. Common Rule is currently in use by more than 20 agencies in the federal government. These include agencies like the Department of Health and Human Services, NASA, and the Department of Education. Not all agencies implement changes to Common Rule at the same time. For example, UNC Charlotte decided to defer implementation of the new Common Rule guidelines until January 31st, 2019, rather than when they were first ratified. Common Rule applies to all federally funded research, such as through grants, and also applies to any research that's conducted by a federally funded institution. UNC Charlotte must comply with Common Rule because UNC Charlotte is classified as a federal contractor. Belmont Report is the short title for The Belmont Report, Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects of Research, reported the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. The Tuskegee syphilis study and other human subject studies that were conducted before the 1970s are the inspiration for the Belmont Report. Prior to the Belmont Report, there really was no concrete shared guidance on how to properly go about protecting human subjects when conducting research. The Belmont Report outlines a few fundamental ethical principles for research. The first is respect for persons, the second is beneficence, and the third is justice. These principles, as well as other elements of the report, are used by institutional review boards and individual researchers to go out constructing research that protects human subjects, that ensures that human autonomy is respected. The respect for persons principle recognizes that all persons are autonomous agents. This means that people have the ability to give consent or to retract consent. Potential research participants must be permitted to exercise their autonomy in decision making to decide whether or not they wish to be part of your study. One of the ways we implement this is through the informed consent process. So, informed consent. What does that really mean? What is informed? Well, you can tell anyone the abstract of what you're doing, what your study's about, but do they understand it? Do they understand the potential risks? A well-written informed consent must outline in terms that your subjects will understand what exactly it is that they are consenting to. What are the potential harms to them? What are the potential benefits? What sort of mechanisms do they have for their own protection while participating in the study? And that's an important element as well. Not only how they'll participate, what happens while they're participating, but what happens if they want to withdraw their participation. It must be clear that just because they consent does not mean that they cannot withdraw that consent at a later time. Consent is conditional. The subject has the right to remove themselves from the process at any time. And on the topic of consent and writing a consent statement, depending on your subject, a written informed consent may not be the best way to go about it. If you're dealing with certain populations, such as the illiterate, it may be required that you provide consent verbally. Another element of consent is who can consent? Well, autonomous agents. In our society, autonomous agents are defined as individuals that are adults. So, in most areas, that means they must be at least 18 years old to give consent. Other than minors, there are other groups that can't give consent either. One is inmates in a prison. They're not considered to be autonomous agents. There are too many factors that would make participating in research coercive. Another element is any individual that has a physical or mental impairment that would prohibit them from being able to give consent, to be able to thoroughly understand what it is that is being asked of them, and to exercise free will in the making of that decision to consent. Beneficence is usually referred to as the do no harm principle of research. This principle requires measuring potential risks against potential benefits. You must recognize through this that all research has the potential to do harm. Not all harms will be life-threatening, not all harms will cause severe psychological impact, but it is important as a researcher to reflect on what you're doing, to reflect on what could happen. You're doing an interview, asking a person to describe in detail their educational experiences. That, for most people, is not going to cause a harmful interaction. But let's say that a person was molested by a teacher at some point in their educational past. That would be a painful thing for them to recall and could actually do psychological harm to them or undo some psychological healing that they had been able to progress through. As a researcher, you're not expected to foresee every possible outcome, which is the reason that the classification of no more than minimal risk research exists. Just because while there are a lot of things that could happen, most are no more harmful than the interactions of daily life. But as a researcher, you must also be responsible in thinking through what is being done, what is being asked, and how a person's information is being used to ensure that no harm will come to the subject that is reasonably within your control to protect. This is one of the most strongly debated elements of research ethics, just because considering harms and benefits really does have a broad definition. Does it imply that if you are doing research on this one person from this one group, if the research doesn't directly benefit them, but might benefit someone in the future that is in a similar group, is that still providing a benefit to them through that? Some philosophers say that no, it's not a direct benefit to that individual person, whereas others take a more broad social interpretation and allow it to just be that the benefit continues on to others. This is a common justification for medical research. It may not be possible to save a person that is having a terminal illness by conducting research on them, but yet their contributions to the research may be beneficial in saving lives in the future. Justice is the principle that has the most to do with your sampling. The concept of justice is to fairly distribute the risk of research. So this means that unless your target population for your sample happens to be specifically impacted by what you're studying, that group should not be unfairly represented in your sample population. The most common violation of this principle in the history of social research has been in the use of one racial group over another for research because the researcher considered them to be more expendable. So not that it would benefit them more to be involved in the research than another group, but simply because the group was convenient in some manner or another. While we talked about vulnerable populations a little bit in respect for persons, it also comes into play here. So it may be easier to get consent from certain groups, such as an imprisoned population or from minors. But if they can't truly give the consent, if they can't exercise consent through being informed, then they really aren't a great candidate for your study unless you are specifically benefiting that area. As much as is possible, your research sample should utilize the general population. So this means not singling out groups unless there is a reason related to the research that a group should be singled out. This also means not excluding groups unless there is a reason that group should be excluded. So, as a student researcher, why should you be concerned? Well, for one, eventually you will go on, hopefully, to do professional research and to do research that adds to the general knowledge of the academy. The other reason is, most likely if you're doing anything with human subjects, even if it's just minimal risk research, then you'll still have to have your research approved by an institutional review board. It is the responsibility of the IRB to ensure that research proposals meet safeguards for human subjects. The IRB has the ability to approve, reject, or require modifications of planned research, essentially to make sure that that research is within compliance of what is expected as a minimum standard for safeguarding human subjects. As we discussed before, some research may be classified as exempt, or some research may be classified as limited review. Even if your research does fall into one of those categories, you'll still have to be familiar with research ethics as it applies to human subjects to create a proposal for the IRB. It should also be noted that while the UNC Charlotte IRB can give approval for your research as it relates to your studies, if you are doing research at other sites, such as inside a school in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg system or at a hospital, you may have to get additional review by either an IRB there at one of those sites or by an external review board. As a graduate student, you've probably heard the IRB mentioned quite a bit, either by faculty that are completing research or by your advisor in reference to your thesis or dissertation research. Well, who is the IRB at UNC Charlotte? The IRB at UNC Charlotte changes membership about once every 2 years and involves faculty and staff from all across campus. It also involves members of external organizations. For example, currently we have a member of the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office on the board. So, key things to take away from this presentation. The primary thing is just the principles of the Belmont Report. What is expected under common rule? So, you need to know that respect for persons involves utilizing informed consent and respecting the autonomy of the individual. You'll need to know that benefits, doing no harm, is important. A subject must take part in research in a way that can have some benefit for them. How that benefit is determined can be a matter of debate, but in your judgment as a researcher, you should see some benefit and be able to explain that benefit to the subjects. Finally, justice. Your process for sampling should be fair and not exploitative. You should be careful of selecting vulnerable populations for your research. If the vulnerable population is the subject of your research, then that should be well defined in a way that you'll be able to explain to the Institutional Review Board why that's important and why it's essential to your research that you have access to that population. Otherwise, you should try avoiding having those groups in your research. You should be familiar with why the IRB exists. The IRB doesn't exist to tell us what we can't do. They exist to help us as researchers protect our subjects. They also exist to protect the interests of the institution. One key thing to remember is they are human. They are researchers. Most of them have their own research projects and have had to go through this process themselves. Think of them as colleagues that will go with you along the research process. Finally, if you have not already done so, you'll need to complete the city certification process. While it's required for this course, it is also a requirement for anyone that is submitting an IRB proposal. I hope this presentation has enlightened you to some of the major points of the ethics of conducting human subjects research. This presentation doesn't cover everything. It doesn't cover every possible case. There may be exceptions to most of the rules. There may also be things that haven't been covered that are considerations for your particular research. Throughout this course, you can ask questions about your own research. You can inquire about specific situations. After this course is completed, you can ask your advisor. You can ask other faculty in your department, or you can reach out to our research integrity officer to find out what actually impacts your research and to get clarification on a specific situation.